Welcome back to The Wandering Naturalist. My name is Brandon, he, him. Unfortunately, Angela couldn't make it. Ironically, in doing a podcast about diseases, her kid is sick and she had to go get him. So sadly, she won't be here, but she sends her thoughts and she's covering her sneezes. Last time, we talked to Dr. Isaiah Tolo about diseases that fish in Minnesota might encounter and the studies he's doing about that. Today, we are talking to Dr. Michelle Power from Macquarie University in Australia. She is passionate about science communication and uses innovative ways to convey STEM to people, including citizen science and even stand-up comedy. So we're really excited to talk to her and the research she's doing that involves the general public, as well as some of the research she's doing herself. Welcome to The Wandering Naturalist. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, thanks very much, Brandon, and hello everyone else out there. So yes, I'm, as Brandon said, Michelle Power. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm based in Sydney, Australia in the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University. And I'm super excited to be here and to talk about wildlife diseases and anything that comes across our paths, Brandon.
I have had a lot of fun talking to you already about diseases before this episode, which you wouldn't think talking about diseases could be that much fun, but some of the stuff you're doing is really interesting. Before we get into that, I am curious, what inspired you to enter the field of research involving wildlife diseases?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because as a scientist, we get asked this question a lot, I guess. And, I find a lot of people answer, and I myself go back to my childhood and what I was interested in. I was always interested in nature and animals, and had a little bug catcher and out was collecting cicadas and lady beetles, and we had these and I've still got them, these really old encyclopedias that had these transparent pages and of a frog, but then when you flipped it, each page was a different
yep.
So just that kind of a whole engagement when I was in my early childhood. And then as I got a bit older, I wanted to be a vet. So clearly there was some kind of interest in animal health or wanting to help animals at a young age. And then somehow at a job in my early years as a research assistant, I was working with parasites, and that just led me into wildlife and parasites. And I guess probably where my childhood passion had been all along.
That is awesome. And studying parasites is fascinating. They can be kind of gross, but their adaptations are just really, really cool.
Yeah, the interactions that they have with their hosts or the animals or that they live on is astounding and so intricate and specific, and the way they've evolved and adapted to live in those environments, like in the host, in the gastrointestinal tract, is just remarkable for some species.
Yeah. Speaking of the gastrointestinal tract, that is actually how I first heard about you. I was doing research, figure out who can we ask to be on this episode. And I found out that as part of your job, you receive a lot of mail from the public with poop in it. Why is that?
We do indeed. We do indeed. Look, so there's a few challenges with working working or researching wildlife, and one of them is actually enabling that you can get enough samples to have rigorous data and across the broad expanses that wildlife or the wildlife species that you're working on inhabits. And so as a small science team can't do all of that. And so we relied on a program or an approach called citizen science, where we get general members of the public to basically help us out with the research. And so we had people, school kids, community groups, people we collected at various sort of environmental fair days, hear about the issue of, I guess, diseases in nature and in wildlife, and help us out in collecting possum poop. So in our cities, we have lots of urban adapted wildlife, and two common ones in Sydney and across Australia actually are the possum, which is very different from your opossums. So yes. I think our possums come across as being a little bit more friendly. And they're kind of like a cat, I think, in there. Okay. They're cute. They are acrobatic. They run across the electric wires in the streets, but they live in our rooms and in our backyards and share the environment with us. And so we were asking people to collect a possum scat and mail that to us. We got about 1,000 samples.
That's a lot of samples. Oh my gosh. Did the public have to do anything special before they mailed it to you? Like, how do you actually mail scat in the mail? I can't imagine the post office likes that a whole lot, or that it smells great when you get it.
Not really sure the post office knew. Hopefully, no one from Australia Post is listening to this.
Yes. You're gonna have
Like,
like helicopters circling your office, people scaling down now.
yeah, we did actually look into that, and because obviously there's lots of nasties in poop that can spread disease. There aren't any kind of stringent rules, I guess, about posting things in Australia, more about jurisdiction control across borders, say. But this is possum scat, and before people could collect, usually they would either attend a little workshop, which we would do either in the school or a library, a community organisation, and they'd jump up and say, yeah, we'd love to help out. And so we'd give them training and a little kit which included some safety gears, so gloves, how to put those gloves on. We talked about the risks associated with possum poop and just generally the risks associated with wildlife and potential transmission of disease agents between possums, other wildlife and us. And then also showed people how to collect the samples safely and package that up. So it was actually in a tube and double bagged. And because possums are omnivores, it actually is quite pleasant poop
Oh,
to deal
awesome.
with. So,
Yeah. The thing I like about that too is you weren't just like I was a little bit under the impression people were just like finding it and mailing it to you, but you're actually giving them training on how to do actual scientific techniques. It feels like that's something that's really important to you. Like beyond the data you're getting from this project, it seems like having people actively engaged in science is a passion of yours.
yeah, it is actually. And part of my job as an academic and researcher is to also teach undergrads. So I guess that kind of passion to teach and to support people's learning and their inquisitive natures and guide and facilitate that is a passion. But particularly with and getting that, I guess, instilled in an early age to attract imaginative and creative people to the science field. And by seeing science in action and doing this, I think people, one, they get a handle on the science and what we do as scientists, and maybe we're not the geeks as we're often portrayed,
Hmm?
but equally they get to understand the scientific process and the robustness of the data that we collect and how that data is translated into solving some of the world's issues. And so it has this multi-layered approach and outcomes for everyone, which is what I'm about, not just getting people to do the service for me in giving me the poop, but really bringing in that education and awareness component.
I love that. I would have loved a project like that as a kid, and I imagine that got a lot of kids really thinking about science and how amazing it can be. I'm wondering as we go on, uh, if you can explain a little bit what zoonosis, and we touched on it a little bit in earlier episodes, and so even more specifically, reverse zoonosis are and
Mm-hmm.
why these are important.
Yeah, yeah. So in my research, I've mentioned that we're interested in wildlife health and disease, but that also extends to thinking about public health. So wildlife species can carry disease agents that can spread to people. And equally, these days, we're seeing a greater connectivity between wildlife and people in shared environments in cities. And we're also now starting to see the reverse. So, a zoonosis is, I guess, a disease causing agent, could be a bacteria or a virus or a parasite transmitting from an animal to a person or being capable of transmitting transmission from an animal to a person. And reverse zoonosis is the opposite. So, human associated disease causing agents or pathogens that are now actually have been disseminated and are establishing themselves in different wildlife species. So some examples of zoonosis, I guess, some topical examples is avian influenza. And
Mhm.
we've seen a few human cases. While it's not a major human issue, we have seen a few sporadic cases occur around the world. So coming from birds and perhaps into other animals, into humans. And then another one is Toxoplasma gondii. Some people may have heard of this. It's a parasite of cats and can spread to people. Mm-hmm. And also,
We
oh yeah, go on. Sorry,
I
Brandon.
was say one of our very first episodes we talked to we did a zombie episode and talked about parasites that kind of change the brain patterns of most creatures, and that
Yeah,
was one of the ones we talked about because
yeah,
that one just
yeah.
fascinates me and creeps me out.
It is, and it's the Californian sea lion over there is highly susceptible to toxo as well.
Yes,
So
I think I forget if it's beluga whales or narwhals in Canada as well. They've been
yeah,
seeing
okay,
them
yep.
being really impacted by them, and it's just fascinating. And I know a really topical example of reverse zoonosis that we don't think about, but it's being studied in the park I work at, is COVID going from people to
Yeah.
deer. And so
Yes.
we actually have the
Mhm.
University of Minnesota studying that in our park. And I think as of 2025, when we're recording this, that study may just end up being concluded in terms of the field work. But now they're going to be doing all the data crunching and whatnot.
Yeah, and that was a big concern when COVID emerged, and particular and here as well, and other countries. And we saw outbreaks in civets, was it, in Europe,
Mm.
and concerns for spread back to bats as well, and what that might mean if it got back in bats in its kind of mutated form that was in humans. And yeah, but luckily that hasn't occurred, at least in some of the higher risk species. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'd heard of zoonosis before and thought about that a lot. Reverse zoonosis, until you had mentioned that term to me, I'd never really thought of. Like I knew about the deer study and I knew about some of the concerns about COVID going to some of these species of concern, just because their numbers are already so small and they've already got a lot of other challenges. But I think that because it's not impacting us directly, it's not something I had thought of. I think it's something that a lot of us had thought of.
No, and you're right. It's really only a term that's been used maybe within the last, more commonly or increasing in use, and also through studies and seeing what's going on as we have that growing greater urbanisation and that more connection to wildlife and to different species. And equally, there was some work done many years ago on emerging infectious diseases such as COVID, which showed that 75% of new and emerging infectious agents actually came from wildlife. And the drivers were things like urbanisation, land clearing, connectivity between domestic animals and wildlife, and that as we break down the barriers between different species, we also connect the different disease agents that each carry. And so that then increases that risk of zoonosis, so transmission from wildlife to people and establishment in people. But now, as we move on, we're now starting to see that reverse risk.
Hmm.
So
And
it's
that
a really interesting field, and I think going forward, it's going to be quite topical.
I imagine so. And I know growing up in my family, I grew up with a lot of kids. And the joke was always that, oh, but one of us would get sick. And by the time that virus went through all of us, it would have mutated and gone through us again, which was obviously just a joke we would tell. But in some ways, does that work with zoonosis and reverse zoonosis, where to go through zoonosis, it changes, it gets in people, it changes and again, it gets in animals. Have we ever seen where it's then gone back to people? Is that a concern?
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of intricate steps that need to occur for a
yeah.
pathogen to move from one host to the next, and so that can be in mutations, but there could also be zero mutations and just that opportunity with that connection. So it's kind of really dependent on whether it's a bacteria or a virus, what type of organism it is, and so forth. And I really don't think we have the answers to that yet, or a simple answer across all taxa. But yeah, there is definitely a risk for that, and particularly with bacteria, and when it comes to antibiotic resistant bacteria or AMR, antimicrobial resistance, I think that's where you might be more likely to have that acquisition and change as it goes through species. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Something else I wanted to touch on with you was One Health in the three spheres of infectious diseases, because it sounds like we're maybe already hitting a few of those spheres in our conversations so far. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more detail what those are.
Yes, so I mentioned that I flagged the connectivity between people, domestic animals, and wildlife, and how that connects the disease agents that each carry and really has an influence on infectious disease transmission and dynamics. A concept that is now, it's a global concept, and it's a framework around understanding and mitigating and addressing infectious diseases, is this concept of One Health. And so One Health basically kind of says that you can't look at a human disease, and particularly an emerging infectious disease, without thinking about what's happening, source population, where it came from, or the steps, I guess, from getting from that animal source into a human source, if it's gone that way, and the role of the environment. So basically, you can't work on one thing in isolation compared to another because everything's connected. And so this concept of One Health includes wildlife, domestic animals, and people, and we all live in a shared environment. the way it's presented, sometimes you might see these kind of three spheres and domestic animals, people, and wildlife. Sorry, domestic animals, people, and the environment is the third sphere, and wildlife are included in the third sphere. But I like to see One Health as wildlife, domestic animals, and people in that shared environment with the pathogens that each carry moving and swimming around between us. So.
Yeah, and that's been something that our other two guests keep bringing up without talking about One Health or the three spheres specifically, but they keep talking about wildlife, humans, and domestic animals.
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
virus is going through there. So I'm really
Mm-hmm.
glad you kind of described that because it really does seem like it's the base level for conversations about this.
It is,
Uh,
and it's growing, and it is getting global recognition, like the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the World Agricultural Organization. I can't think of them all, United Nations, but there is a quadripartite, like a global quadripartite agreement to consider the risk of emerging infectious diseases and a One Health framework, and then that's spread around all countries around the world. So
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the other research you've been doing, other than just having people mailing you possum scat. And if there's anything you found that's particularly surprising while you're doing it, or any interesting stories with any of your research.
yeah, we do a lot. So we work on. So I guess the lab is set up in that we have lots of different models for pathogens or disease-causing agents, but not viral agents. So we work on bacteria, so antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We work on protozoan parasites, so Cryptosporidium and Giardia, and you might have heard of some of these, I guess, in your parks because they are spread through contaminated water and swimming. Um, and then we ask questions, I guess, relative to different animals and situations they're in and their connectivity to people. So, for example, we think about transmission of disease causing agents in captive breeding programs. And so, one group we're working on is the Tasmanian devils, and we're thinking about how when animals are bred in captivity, Tasmanian devils or other species are bred in captivity, they're exposed to our organisms and other organisms, and then what that might mean for success of the program and translocation of animals between sites and from breeding facilities. We also do a bit of work on koalas. Koalas are very susceptible to zoonosis, and antibiotics are used for treating koalas who come into wildlife care to eliminate chlamydia and to preserve and conserve the species. And with the issue of antibiotic resistance, not just in people but in wildlife now, if there's only a couple of antibiotics available to treat chlamydia in koalas because they have a very sensitive gut microbiome. And should those antibiotics or should a resistant strain of chlamydia emerge, then we don't have any way to control chlamydia in koalas. So that's one other area we're working on. We do marine mammals and we do a lot of work on bats. And I do have some funny stories about standing under bat colonies for the first time, going into the field and looking up and thinking, 4 o'clock in the morning, 20,000 big bats. Like these aren't the little microbats that you folks get. These have like a wingspan sometimes of 2 meters.
Oh, wow.
So they're the
That's
big.
almost 6 feet. Or that is around 6 feet.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Their wingspan. Their bodies are a little bit smaller, but
Yeah.
their wingspan is quite significant. So, but looking up in the sky as they fly in, watching them and thinking, oh, it's raining, but actually they're all urinating as they come back. So
No.
there's little droplets. Yeah, so we're doing a lot. We're asking questions about transmission, that connectivity, movement between different hosts, even just discovering new parasites. There's a helminth, something unique that we're working on is a helminth in Tasmanian devils, and it's not found in any other species and it's thought to be extinct. And it's actually listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. And the Tasmanian Devil Conservation Program actually also has made this worm part of its recovery program, and to also conserve the pathogens or parasites that are associated with devils. So we've got this one sample from the 70s. Yeah, this one sample from the 70s from a museum, and we've got to tease it out and then try and get a genetic signature. I don't know if we'll manage to do this or not, but it's a little side project. So we do a lot.
That's amazing. And I would never have considered like preserving the pathogens either, but that is part of a species habitat. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So exactly, and I think that's a lot of kind of conservation agencies are also realizing the significance of pathogens and parasites to host groups and population health of hosts, and really starting to see it. They're starting to have a different perspective, I guess, towards those organisms. So.
Yeah, very much. I think we've always been like, oh, we got to get rid of them. They're awful. They're terrible. They make me sneeze.
Yeah,
But there might be some benefits from having them around too. That's really, really cool.
yeah, yeah. And if you think about when animals are in a captive environment, you really break those parasite life cycles. If
Yeah.
the vector's not there to enable transmission, or if it's a direct host transmission, and they're constantly hosing out kind of pens and cages, you're totally removing those parasites. So there's also the risk that when you take those species back into the wild, they're at risk because they haven't been exposed to those parasites in the captive breeding programs, and so you can have this kind of dual layered kind of poor outcomes, I guess, if you don't think about that host parasite interactions and health in those species that we're trying to conserve.
Yeah. No, that's really, really fascinating. I think something you said that surprised me too was just how widespread antibiotic resistance was. Like I picture if there's going to be antibiotic resistance, it's going to be by a farm or by where people are, things like that. But you found it in some pretty remote areas, haven't you?
Yeah, we have. Yeah. So you're right. A lot of people do think that antibiotic resistance tends to be more associated with people and farm animals. I think another confusion that people have is that they think antibiotic resistance is actually associated with the immune system or themselves and or the other species, but don't recognize that it's the actual bacterial species that has the power to resist antibiotics, or the genetic mechanisms that enable to resist those drugs that are used to treat them. So, kind of within that One Health framework, a lot of resistant bacteria just in a general healthy person who has not actually had any antibiotics. We also acquire them from the environment. So, if we tested our poop, we would probably see that we have harmless bacteria that have resistance genes or genetic mechanisms to enable them to resist antibiotics. And so, with these in the environment, that One Health concept again, that transmission to wildlife, and that's one big area of my research as well, is looking at that dissemination to different wildlife species. But I did actually look at this in Antarctica. And so we went down in 2010, and thinking about the disposal of sewage at Antarctic bases, and again that human pollution with antibiotic resistance and dissemination into the environment. And so we found quite a lot of resistant. We were looking at genetic determinants, not isolating bacteria, and we found a lot of those in the local environment and wildlife examples down there as well. So
Wow. And if there's anywhere I think would be remote or not have that, it'd be Antarctica. But you
yeah,
have people
yeah,
living there by bases. That's
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, and other groups around the world have also shown that in different parts of Antarctica as well, in penguins and seals. And, yeah.
When I know no, that is a huge concern is antibiotic resistance. Like a world without antibiotics is honestly a terrifying thing to think about. Is there
Mm.
anything our listeners can do to reduce antibiotic resistance in the wild or even to help with reverse zoonosis?
Yeah, so I guess I guess there's two parts to this. Is one is if you're just generally at home and you're sick and you do get prescribed antibiotics, make sure you follow the instructions and take them to the end. I guess also as an individual, recognize that antibiotics really only work against bacteria, and so if you've got the flu, you're unlikely to be given antibiotics from a doctor, and they're not going to help if you have a flu anyway in most cases. Although now there's antivirals and they're also classed as antimicrobials, and in future we may start to see an issue around resistance in viruses to our antivirals. So you see this kind of trade-off. Those organisms want to survive, so they're going to find ways to overcome whatever we do to eradicate them. Your listeners, they're out in the park enjoying nature, and I guess when you go out into nature, one of the best things people can do is take everything back with you. Even I know a lot, and I think I used to do it. I don't do it anymore, but you might have an apple, and you'll throw the core back to nature. But you think about the oral microbiome is all over that apple, and so you're potentially putting your organisms into an environment where they actually shouldn't be and risking wildlife. So take those things out, because the things I think that we often try to do to help wildlife can sometimes have unexpected impacts. And equally, poop. Avoid doing that in nature because that's probably one of the biggest kind of influences of spreading our organisms into the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about for listeners interested in the scientific career? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, so I guess if you're a young listener, and you're at school and you've got your passion for nature or rocks or whatever kind of area of science you might be interested in, space, I always think people should follow their passions. I think if you do anything, we spend a lot of time at work just generally, and if you can do something that you really like and science is it, then don't let people dissuade you from that. The other thing I think about science is it's a place where you can just have total imagination and total creativity in trying to address some of the kind of global issues that we're facing. And so people who have those skills, or you might think that you're an artist or a cook, but all those things roll into science and research. As you progress, I guess, through, one would need to go to university, and often they're competitive to get into degrees, or depending on the degree, you might have to make a case or have an interview. And so all the little extra things like clubs, science clubs, citizen science, anything you can do that kind of shows your passion can be helpful in that regard. And I guess get out and talk to scientists. So understand the job and understand early how to get through navigating to become a world's greatest scientist. So.
That is great advice. Thank you so much. Thanks for all of the work you're doing, and especially the work you're doing to engage the public. I just really think that that's amazing. And we talk all the time, how do we get people into STEM? And I think what you're doing, getting kids out there, teaching them how to do things, that's just really the best way to do it. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. It was just so much fun.
Thanks very much, Brandon. And I really appreciate the invite to come chat to you and to all the listeners out there.
In the last 50 years, there has been a steady increase in wildlife mortality caused by infectious diseases. When combined with other stresses, a disease in wildlife can result in serious conservation challenges for wildlife management agencies, which we heard a lot of. It's necessary for us to increase species protections by looking at this. So beyond conservation concerns, the impacts of wildlife disease on species are clear and present danger to the economy. Brandon, what stood out to you from these conversations that maybe, surprised you or got you thinking differently?
Honestly, I think just thinking about diseases and wildlife in general, especially with fish, that's something that I haven't really thought of a whole lot, but I hear a lot about the big diseases, the ones that might impact us as humans, but thinking about some of the diseases that are impacting the animals themselves that have an impact, but maybe don't have we're not going to get sick from it. I think it was really fascinating to hear that, and thinking about how are animals transmitting these diseases.
Right.
Because again, that's just I know how I transmitted cold to you or how my daughter got me sick. I don't think about
it's always the kids.
It's always the kids.
They're disgusting.
Exactly. And I just don't normally think about animals
right.
sneezing on each other or transmitting diseases to each other because it's something that doesn't impact me directly. So I think it gave me another perspective to think about.
Yeah, I think, again, challenging what we see in those headlines, really thinking about how that impacts us and what we can do to change that, whether it's reporting something or changing what we're doing in our backyard. All of these things can really, if we do them together, have a big impact. So there are simple steps, again, you can take to prevent. We talked about some of those, reducing activities that bring animals into small geographical areas. When it comes to the bait you're using with fish, when it comes to baiting, you could call it baiting because you want to see the deer, so you're baiting it in to see it. Scent lures, all of those are perfect examples. Clean your bird feeders and keep wild animals away from domesticated farmed animals. Thank you to our generous guests for sharing more around wildlife diseases, Michelle Karstensen, Isaiah Tolo, and Michelle Powers. Again, it can be a bit overwhelming, but knowing that this research is happening and there's teams of people working on them like our guest, I think really does give me a bit of comfort knowing that in Minnesota, I think we really do lead the way with some of these things. So it's really great to hear from them all and to share. If you still have questions for our guest, again, we covered a lot with those diseases. And while we would love to give each of them a ton of time to talk about, specifically like CWD or fish kills, ask questions on our social media. This is a great place to generate discussions and questions that we are happy to answer or for future topics. You can do this on our Facebook page or Instagram, the Wandering Naturalist Podcast of Three Rivers Park District, and type in Whispers of Wildlife Diseases in the search function.
You can also give us feedback, ask questions, and see when Angela and I are doing in-person events where you can come wander with us. You can email us at wanderingnaturalist@threeriversparks.org. Please leave us a review and share with your friends where you downloaded our podcast from. Your reviews and shares help our podcast to reach more people. A special thanks to Tom Knisely for arranging interviews and Monica Rauschwater for guest outreach. Thank you to Emily Thompson for guest support, and of course to our amazing social media team for posting on Facebook and Instagram. We hope you enjoyed learning with us today. Now that you know, what will you do in your wanderings?